The sensor room on monitoring station Theta 9 was never a quiet place. But it was never truly loud either. It sat somewhere in the middle, the kind of place where machines hummed, where junior analysts talked in low voices, and where the smell of something warm being heated in a small cooking unit drifted in from the break room every few hours. It was a room built for routine. It had been doing routine for 11 years. Dreveth Sol liked routine. He was a senior intelligence curator, which was a title that sounded more impressive than it was. It mostly meant that he was responsible for making sure the sensor data coming in from the Deep Space Relay Network was properly sorted, tagged, and sent upward to the people who were supposed to care about it. In 11 years, he had never sent anything upward that made anyone panic. He was sitting at his main console on a day that felt like every other day, when the anomaly alert came in. It did not arrive with bells or flashing lights. It came in as a small yellow icon in the lower right corner of his screen. The same icon that appeared when a gas cloud drifted into a monitored sector, or when a piece of old debris crossed a sensor boundary. He finished the form he was filling out before he clicked on it. The alert was from Relay Buoy 7 Keth, which sat at the very edge of the deep monitoring network, so far out that its signals took almost 3 hours to reach the station. The buoy had detected an object. The object was moving. That was, in itself, not unusual. Space was full of things that moved. What made Dreveth Sol put down his stylus was the size estimate. The buoy's first reading put the object at roughly 400 meters in length. That was large, but not impossible. There were asteroids that size, and a few old colonial transport ships from the early expansion era had been built close to that scale. He filed a standard observation notice and flagged it for the morning review. Then the second reading came in, which was an updated estimate from the same buoy, after it had run its more detailed algorithms. The second reading said 900 meters. Dreveth Sol looked at both numbers for a long time. He opened a fresh form, not a morning review form, a priority notice form. He filled it out carefully, double-checking each field, and sent it to his supervisor, Curator Prime Helast, who was currently 3 floors up in the station's administrative section, eating his midday meal. Helast came down faster than Dreveth Sol expected. They stood together at the main console and looked at the data. The object was still moving. It had a consistent heading and a consistent velocity. It was not tumbling the way a loose rock would tumble. It was not drifting the way debris drifted. It moved the way things moved when something was pushing them. "Drive signature?" Helast asked. Dreveth Sol had already run the comparison. He had checked it against the full database of known drive signatures, every cataloged species, every registered vessel type, every experimental propulsion system that had ever been documented in the Empire's 4,000-year history of interstellar observation. "No match," he said. Helast was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Dreveth Sol to run it again, which was the kind of request that people made when they didn't want to believe the first answer. Dreveth Sol ran it again. The result was the same. They sent a priority amber report to Central Command. An amber report meant, "Something unusual, please advise." It did not mean, "We are afraid." Dreveth Sol chose the amber category deliberately. He told himself it was because there was no evidence of danger. He did not ask himself why his hands felt slightly cold. The station's automated hailing system was already running. It was always running in the background whenever an unknown object was detected. A constant broadcast across 17 different frequency bands, in 15 different languages, cycling through standard greeting protocols that had been developed over centuries of first contact theory. The hailing system sent its signal toward the object and then waited. No response came. This was not by itself alarming. Many objects did not respond to hails. Rocks did not respond. Derelict ships did not respond. Automated probes sometimes did not respond because they were not designed to. There were plenty of explanations. Dreveth Sol listed the explanations in his head. He found them less comforting than he expected. The third size estimate came in 4 hours later. The buoy had been running continuous analysis, tightening its measurements as it gathered more data. The third estimate said the object was 1.2 kilometers long. Junior analyst Perith, who was 23 years old and had been on the station for 8 months, saw the number and made a sound that was not quite a word. Dreveth Sol looked at her and then looked back at the screen. "Log it," he said. Send the updated figures with the existing report. Perith logged it. She also, without being asked, quietly ran a cross-reference check to see if there were any known species in the database that built ships of that size. She found 3. All 3 were extinct. All 3 had been extinct for more than 600 years. She did not tell Dravath Sol about that search, but she saved the results. The object continued toward the station at its steady, unhurried speed. It did not accelerate. It did not slow down. It moved like something that had decided where it was going a long time ago and saw no reason to change its mind. Dravath Sol sent a second report. This one he classified as Priority Red. A red report meant, "This is unusual enough that someone above my level should be paying attention right now." He had sent exactly 2 red reports in 11 years. The first had been for a rogue artificial gravity disturbance that turned out to be a malfunctioning mining platform. The second was this. Central Command responded within an hour, which told him that someone had, in fact, been paying attention. They asked for everything, every sensor reading, every size estimate, every attempt at communication, every detail. They also said that the 7th Fleet had been notified. Dravath Sol did not know exactly what that meant in practical terms, but it made his cold hands feel colder. He stayed at his console through what should have been his rest period. Perith stayed too, without being asked. They watched the data together in silence, eating food from packages because neither of them wanted to be away from the screens long enough to heat anything properly. At some point in the early morning hours, something changed. The object's heading shifted. It was not a large shift, only 3 degrees. But 3 degrees was not the kind of change that happened by accident. A rock moving through space did not adjust its course by exactly 3 degrees. Debris did not navigate. Things that drifted did not make corrections. The new heading, when Dravath Sol plotted it out, pointed directly at monitoring station Theta 9. He looked at this for a long time. Then he looked at the distance between the object and the station. Then he did the calculation for how long it would take the object to arrive at its current speed. He did not share the calculation with Perith. He could tell from her face that she had done it herself. He sent a priority red amended report to Central Command. The amendment said that the unknown object had changed course and was now on an intercept trajectory with their station. He wrote the words in plain, simple language because he felt that this was not a moment for careful diplomatic phrasing. He read the report back to himself once before sending it, and he thought it sounded like something a frightened person had written. He sent it anyway, because it was accurate. Central Command responded again. This time there was a name attached to the response. Admiral Veth Karanis, of the Imperial 7th Fleet. The Admiral's message was short. It said that a reconnaissance squadron had been dispatched. It said that monitoring station Theta 9 was to remain on full observation duty and continue all attempts at communication. It said that the station crew should not be alarmed. Dravath Sol read the phrase, "should not be alarmed," and thought about it for a while. He pulled up the sensor feed and looked at the object again. At this range, even with the station's long-distance optics running at maximum, it was still mostly a shape. A long, dark shape against the deeper dark of space. But it was no longer a vague shape. It had edges. It had structure. It had, if he looked at certain parts of it with the right filtering algorithms, what appeared to be markings on its hull. He zoomed in on the markings. They were not symbols he recognized. They were arranged in horizontal lines along a section near what appeared to be the front of the vessel. They looked like language. He copied the visual and attached it to a new observation log. He also noticed something else, which he put in a separate note that he filed without sending it anywhere yet. The hull of the vessel, in the places where the optics could get a clear look, showed marks. Old marks. The kind of marks that heat and violence left behind. Deep scoring. Areas where the surface had clearly been damaged and then repaired. Whatever this vessel was, it had been in a fight before. More than one fight, by the look of it. And after each fight, someone had fixed the damage carefully enough that the ship could fly again. But they had not smoothed over the marks. The evidence of what the ship had survived was still there, written into its hull in a language of burns and pressure fractures. Dravath Sol sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the sensor room for a while. The machines hummed. The air smelled faintly of whatever Perith had heated up at some point. Everything in the room was exactly as it always was. He looked at his original report. The first one, the one he had sent when the object was just a yellow icon in the corner of his screen. He had classified it as Priority Amber. He had chosen that classification because there was no evidence of danger. He thought about the scorch marks on the hull. He thought about the 3 species in the database that had built ships this size, all of them extinct. He thought about the course correction, 3 precise degrees, aimed directly at his station. He did not change the classification of the original report. It was already filed, and it would have been improper to alter it retroactively. But he sat there in the humming room and understood, in a quiet and unhurried way, that he had made a mistake. The object kept coming. It did not speed up. It did not slow down. It moved at the same steady pace it had moved at since the first buoy picked it up, patient and deliberate, and entirely unconcerned with whether or not anyone on monitoring station Theta 9 was watching it. It had not responded to a single hail. Dreveth Saul pulled up the communication logs and counted. In the hours since the object had first been detected, the station's automated system had sent 412 separate hailing attempts across all 17 frequency bands. It had used every language in the database. It had tried standard greeting protocols, emergency protocols, distress protocols, and, as a last measure, a very old protocol that had not been actively used in about 300 years, but which some theorists believed had a mathematical elegance that any spacefaring civilization should be able to recognize. 412 attempts, 0 responses. He filed his 3rd report of the night. It was careful and factual and professional. At the end of it, in the section marked Additional Observations, he wrote one sentence that was none of those things. He wrote, "It knows we are here." He looked at that sentence for a while after he wrote it. Then he left it in and sent the report. Outside the station's hull, the unknown vessel continued on its heading, closing the distance with a patience that felt almost personal. Sue. Part 2. The Intelligence Catastrophe. Admiral Veth Karanis had not slept in 31 hours, which was not unusual for her during active operations. What was unusual was that she could not stop looking at the image on her briefing screen, the long dark shape, the hull markings, the scorch patterns that looked like the vessel had been through several fires and come out the other side each time. She had been looking at it, off and on, since the Priority Red report had come in from monitoring station Theta 9. She had 43 years of service in the Imperial 7th Fleet. She had seen strange things. She had seen things that most officers never saw, and she had dealt with all of them by being organized, methodical, and calm. She intended to deal with this the same way. She called in the Xenomorphic Studies Division. Piriel arrived on the fleet command vessel 3 hours after she was contacted. She was a small person, with very large credentials, and the particular kind of confidence that came from spending 20 years being the smartest analyst in every room she entered. She shook the Admiral's hand and looked at the data and said, almost immediately, "Fascinating." The Admiral asked her what she meant. Piriel pulled up her own screen and started working through the sensor readings with the focused energy of someone doing what they had spent their entire career training to do. She cross-referenced the drive signature against 12 separate databases. She ran the hull geometry through 3 different structural analysis algorithms. She compared the size, the mass readings, the thermal signature, and the electromagnetic profile against everything that had ever been documented about every known spacefaring civilization. After 2 hours, she looked up from her screen and said, "It's not Kethian." The Admiral waited. "It's also not Voral, not Shendul, not the Collective, not the Outer Arm Independence, not any of the pre-expansion civilizations we have records on." Piriel listed 14 more species, and dismissed each one methodically. "The drive signature doesn't match anything. The hull material, based on thermal reflection, is something I've never seen before. The geometry is unusual. It's designed for something, but I'm not yet sure what. I'd need more time with the data." "How much time?" the Admiral asked. "A week, ideally. Maybe less if something useful comes up." The Admiral nodded. She had expected this. The universe was large, and she had always believed it held more surprises than the Empire's 4,000-year history had yet managed to catalog. She dispatched 3 reconnaissance probes to get closer readings and told Peril she would have everything the probes could collect. The probes went out. 2 of them returned good data. The third one simply stopped transmitting at a distance of roughly 8 kilometers from the unknown vessel, without warning and without any apparent cause. It was not destroyed. There was no debris, no explosion signature, no energy discharge. It simply went quiet and stayed quiet. Peril noted this with visible interest and wrote a lengthy annotation in her analysis file. The Admiral noted it differently. She noted it the way an experienced military officer notes a thing that has no explanation, carefully, and with the awareness that things without explanations sometimes become explanations for other things. The vessel had still not responded to any hail. By this point, the count was over 800 attempts. The communications team had tried everything in the standard protocols. They had also, at the suggestion of one of the younger officers, tried several non-standard approaches: mathematical sequences, frequency patterns derived from pulsar timing, a simple repeating series of prime numbers. The theory behind the prime numbers was that any civilization capable of interstellar travel would recognize them as an intentional signal. The vessel did not respond to the prime numbers. It did not respond to anything. What it did do, on the 4th day, was start transmitting on its own. The signal came in on a frequency that the Imperial Communications Array had been monitoring as part of standard background noise collection. The vessel had apparently identified this frequency and chosen it deliberately, or at least, that was the only explanation anyone could come up with for why the transmission appeared on that exact channel at that exact moment. The signal was audio. It took the decryption team 16 hours to establish that it was audio, and another 6 hours to process it into something that could be heard. When they finally played it through the briefing room speakers, the analysts fell very quiet. It was music. That was not the word anyone used at first, because the concept of music as a universal category was itself something that decades of xenolinguistics had repeatedly argued about. But that was what it sounded like, a repeating pattern of sound with rhythm and structure. Voices layered over a heavy, repetitive percussion. The voices were saying something, but it took another full day to work out the phonemes well enough to attempt a translation. When the translation came back, Peril read it 3 times. The words described marching. They described fire. They described walking into something terrible and not stopping. Not because the people walking were not afraid, but because stopping was simply not something they were willing to do. The specific imagery was strange and required significant interpretation, but the emotional content, even filtered through 2 layers of translation software, was not ambiguous at all. It was the kind of song that people sang when they were going to war. Peril filed her analysis. In the conclusion section, she wrote that the vessel was most likely an automated probe. The transmission could be a pre-programmed sequence, not an intelligent response to their presence. She used the word likely, and then, after a moment's thought, underlined it. Not because she was certain, because she wanted to be certain, which was a different thing entirely. The Admiral read the analysis. She also read, separately, the note from the communications team about the frequency the vessel had chosen for its transmission, the specific background monitoring channel that only existed in Imperial communications arrays, that would not be known to anyone who had not spent time studying Imperial technology at close range. She thought about that for a long time. Then she called a command meeting. The meeting was attended by herself, her 3 senior fleet commanders, Peril, and 2 representatives from Central Command who had arrived by fast courier the day before, and who mostly listened without saying much. They went through the data piece by piece: the drive signature, the hull material, the lost probe, the transmission, the translation, the frequency selection. When they were done, one of the senior commanders asked the question that everyone in the room had been sitting with. "What is it?" Nobody answered immediately. Peril opened her mouth and then closed it again, which was something none of them had ever seen her do before. "Unknown," the Admiral said finally. "That's our current classification." She made it sound like a practical statement. It was also an honest one. In 43 years, she had never classified something as unknown, and meant it the way she meant it now. The vessel had, by this point, come close enough that the fleet's own optical systems could get a much better look at it than the relay buoys had managed. The images were clearer, the detail sharper, the shape more defined. It was long and dark, and built along lines that suggested function over everything else. No decorative elements, no visible external structures that didn't appear to serve a clear purpose. The hull was marked with that writing, or language-like series of symbols, that Dravath Sol had first noted, and the scorch marks were even more visible now. There were areas where the hull had been repaired multiple times, where you could see, if you looked carefully at the layering of the material, that something had burned through, or broken, and been fixed, and then burned again, and been fixed again. Someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to keep this vessel flying. It had not changed course since the initial 3-degree adjustment. It was still aimed at monitoring station Theta 9. It had reached the outer edge of the station's proximity zone, and then, with the same deliberate precision that had characterized all of its movements, it had decelerated. It was now sitting at exactly the boundary of Imperial sovereign space. Not inside, not outside, exactly on the line. A line that was legal and cartographic rather than physical. A line that existed in databases and treaty documents and navigation charts, but not in any material sense in the vacuum of space. The vessel had found that line with a precision that suggested it knew exactly where it was. It sat there, still transmitting its music on the background monitoring channel, still not responding to hails, still, as far as every sensor and probe and analysis tool the Imperial 7th Fleet could bring to bear, doing absolutely nothing that could be classified as hostile. Peril updated her analysis file with a new note. The note said that the vessel's positioning at the boundary of sovereign space was either a coincidence or a deliberate act. She deleted the word coincidence and did not replace it. The note now simply said the positioning was deliberate. She saved it, and then sat for a while looking at the screen, without typing anything else. The Admiral, in her own quarters late that night, looked at the hull image again. She looked at the scorch marks. She looked at the writing on the hull. She looked at the clean, functional lines of the ship's construction. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She opened a channel to her senior logistics officer and asked a question that had nothing to do with tactics or sensors or translation algorithms. She asked how long it would take to get a full fleet to this position if she needed one. The answer came back, 72 hours, with current deployment positions. She said thank you and closed the channel. She sat in the dark for a while. The music from the transmission was still playing softly on her personal speaker. She had asked for a copy of it to be sent to her quarters, and she wasn't sure why. It wasn't pleasant exactly. It was heavy and repetitive, and the translated words described violence and endurance in the same breath. But there was something in it, some quality that, even translated and filtered and processed until very little of the original remained, still carried a feeling across the distance of whatever space separated that ship from everything she knew. She turned the music off and tried to sleep. She did not succeed particularly well. The vessel sat on the border and waited. It did not ask for anything. It did not threaten anything. It had arrived, positioned itself with mathematical exactness, and settled into what appeared to be a state of complete patience. The Empire's intelligence apparatus, the most comprehensive in the known galaxy, had now spent 4 days throwing everything it had at a single ship. It had run every test, queried every database, tried every communication protocol, sent probes toward it, and watched one go silent without explanation. At the end of 4 days, what it knew about the vessel was the following. It was large. It was not from any known civilization. Its drive signature matched nothing in the records. Its hull material was unfamiliar. It transmitted old and warlike music on a frequency it should not have been able to identify. It had positioned itself on the exact legal boundary of Imperial space, and it was, by every available measure, simply waiting. What it did not know was who had built it, where it had come from, what it wanted, what it was capable of, or why it had come here specifically. It did not know these things despite having some of the finest analytical minds in 4,000 years of Imperial history working on the problem. Peril, who was those analytical minds in concentrated form, had filed 7 updates to her analysis. Each one was thorough and carefully reasoned and built on the previous ones. Each one ended with the conclusion that the vessel was probably an automated probe. She had stopped underlining the word probably after the third update, not because she was more certain, because she had decided that the underline was calling attention to something she would rather not draw attention to. The vessel sat on the line, and the music played, and the Empire tried to understand what it was looking at. And somewhere inside that long, dark hull, something that no sensor had yet been able to map, continued doing whatever it was doing, in whatever way it worked, with the complete and unhurried calm of something that had been waiting for a very long time, and had no objection to waiting a little longer. Shied. Part 3. The Empire Strikes First. Fleet Commander Joss Arakin had fought 41 engagements in his career. He had fought boarding actions and long-range artillery duels and fleet-scale maneuvers in contested nebulae, where visibility was almost nothing. He had won 38 of his 41 engagements, lost 2, and had one that still showed up in the tactical training curriculum under the category of outcomes dependent on factors outside standard models. He was, by the reckoning of most people qualified to reckon such things, the finest active combat commander in the Imperial 7th Fleet. He did not feel like the finest anything, as he sat in the command chair of his flagship and looked at the vessel on his tactical display. The Admiral's orders had come through that morning. They were clear and specific. Take the interception squadron, 12 warships, including 3 heavy cruisers, to the boundary of sovereign space and intercept the unknown vessel. Attempt communication. Establish a defensive perimeter. If the vessel failed to respond and continued any aggressive movement, he was authorized to use appropriate force. The phrase appropriate force was one Arakin had used many times in his career. He had always known, each time he used it, exactly what it meant. This was the first time it felt like a phrase that might mean very different things, depending on things he didn't yet understand. He deployed his squadron in standard interception formation, his 3 heavy cruisers in a triangular pattern, with the lighter vessels spread between them for coverage. It was a formation that his crew could execute in their sleep, and they did execute it, smoothly and efficiently, without any of the discussion or hesitation that might have suggested they felt anything other than routine confidence. He observed the unknown vessel on his screens as his squadron moved into position. It remained exactly where it had been for the past 6 days, sitting on the boundary line, transmitting its low, rhythmic music, not responding to anything. It was large enough now, close enough, that his own optical sensors could see it with real clarity. He looked at it for a long time. The scorch marks on the hull were visible at this range without enhancement. They were old marks. He could tell that much from the way the repairs sat over them, the layering of material that came from multiple rounds of damage and restoration. Whatever had burned and broken the hull of this vessel had done so more than once, and the vessel had survived each time, and the people who operated it had repaired it each time, and had not, for whatever reason, ever bothered to make the scars disappear. He found that detail more interesting than he expected to. The hailing attempts from his own communications array began the moment his squadron was in range. Standard protocols, all 17 frequencies, all 15 languages, the full sequence. The unknown vessel gave the same response it had given to every hail for the past 6 days. Nothing. Arakin waited 2 hours. This was procedure, and he believed in procedure. When the 2 hours had passed and there was still no response, he looked at his tactical officer and said, in the same voice he used for everything, "Weapons free. Targeting solutions on non-critical systems. We are issuing a warning strike, not an attack." His tactical officer confirmed. The targeting solutions went to the weapons teams. The weapons teams confirmed readiness. It was smooth and practiced and took less than 3 minutes. He gave the order. The first salvo was a series of focused energy bursts, the kind of weapon that, at this intensity, would score and heat the surface of a hull without penetrating it. The kind of weapon that said, "We can hurt you, and we know it, and now so do you." It was the standard opening move in any engagement, where the goal was compliance rather than destruction. The energy bursts reached the hull of the unknown vessel, and then they stopped. Arakin stared at his display. He had given orders to fire weapons approximately 600 times in his career. He had never once seen what he was looking at now. The energy bursts had not been absorbed. They had not been deflected by a physical shield or a barrier field of any kind that his sensors could detect. They had simply, and there was no better word for it, stopped. They had lost coherence at the surface of the hull, dissipating into low-level heat in the space between his weapons and the vessel's exterior. "Report," he said. His tactical officer reported. There was nothing in the sensor data that explained what had happened. No shield signature, no energy absorption pattern, no reflective field of any kind. The energy had gone out, reached the hull, and then ceased to be the energy he had fired. "Again," he said. "Full power." They fired again at full power. The same thing happened. Erican sat very still in his command chair. He was aware of every member of his bridge crew being aware of him. In 41 engagements, he had never gone completely still in his command chair. He was doing it now. He made himself move. He leaned forward slightly. He looked at a secondary screen. He kept his voice level. Kinetic rounds. Pattern 7. Pattern 7 was a spread of kinetic projectiles at multiple velocities, the kind of attack that tested defensive systems broadly, rather than probing one specific point. The kinetic rounds fired. They crossed the distance toward the unknown vessel. They slowed. Not immediately, not all at once, but over the last 2 kilometers of their travel, they lost velocity in a way that violated what Arakan understood about physics in open space. By the time they reached the hull, they were moving at a fraction of their launch speed. They struck the hull with roughly the same impact force as a person throwing a stone. There was not enough energy in the contact to leave a mark. Arakan's tactical officer said, very quietly, "Commander," and then stopped. "I see it," Arakan said. He ordered a guided missile salvo next. Guided missiles were different from energy weapons and kinetic rounds. They were intelligent, they tracked and adjusted. They were designed to navigate around interference and find their targets despite countermeasures. The salvo of 12 missiles launched from his heaviest cruiser. 6 of them lost guidance lock at 3 kilometers from the vessel and began flying in random directions before eventually exhausting their fuel and going dark. 3 more lost lock at 1 kilometer and began circling in wide, slow spirals, like birds that had forgotten where they were going. 2 reached the hull and detonated with approximately 1/5 of their designed explosive yield. 1 did not detonate at all. It simply touched the hull and stopped, sitting there, and did not go off. The bridge crew was quiet. Arakan ordered his squadron into a flanking movement, a standard tactic where a portion of his force swung wide to engage from a different angle while the main formation held attention. It was a maneuver he had used 20 times. It was reliable. The flanking group moved into position, or so their navigation systems told them. Arakan watched the flanking group's transponder signals and then, after 18 minutes, looked at the actual sensor data for their physical position. There was a difference. His flanking group's navigation systems were reporting them as being in a completely different position from where the external sensor data placed them. They were, according to his external sensors, approximately 20,000 kilometers from where their own instruments believed they were. They had been, apparently, moving in the wrong direction without knowing it, guided by navigation data that was telling them something that was not true. Arakan sent a signal to the flanking group's commander. A simple signal, a tight beam burst on a physical frequency that did not rely on any navigation data. He told her what his external sensors showed. There was a pause. Then her response came back. Her crew's instruments all showed them in the correct position. There was no malfunction showing on any of her navigation boards. He told her to trust his sensors and correct course using only direct observation of reference stars. She did. 20 minutes later, she confirmed her actual position. She did not say anything else, but Arakan had known her for 12 years, and he could hear something in the short confirmation that he had never heard in her voice before. He pulled back his full formation to a standard holding distance and looked at the unknown vessel on his tactical display. It had not moved during the entire engagement. It had not deployed any visible defensive systems. It had not fired anything. It had not, as far as any of his sensors could determine, done anything at all in response to what had just happened. It was still transmitting its music on the background channel. The weapons had stopped working. The missiles had lost guidance and failed to detonate properly. The kinetic rounds had slowed without explanation. The flanking maneuver had been quietly and completely undone without any visible action from the vessel, and none of it had provoked a response. Not even the kind of response that said, "You annoyed me." Not even the adjustment of an antenna. Not a single photon of directed energy came from that hull in their direction. It had, as far as Arakin could tell, not even noticed. He sat in his command chair for a long time after giving the order to hold position. He was organizing his report in his head. He believed in precise reports, clear, factual, ordered by time. He ran through the sequence of events and the data and the observations and thought about how to describe what had happened. He thought about the scorch marks on the hull. Someone had done this before. The burns and the blast damage and the careful repairs. Someone, somewhere, had thrown something at this vessel. Probably many things. Probably with more resources than he had available. And the vessel had survived all of it, and been repaired and come back, and whoever had tried to hurt it had not, apparently, succeeded well enough to prevent it from arriving here, today, sitting on the boundary of Imperial space, and transmitting a war song on a channel it should not have been able to find. He wrote his report. It was 4 pages. It was precise and factual and carefully ordered. He read it twice before he sent it. At the very end, in the additional notes section, he wrote 4 words, "It is not fighting." He looked at those 4 words. Then he added 5 more. "It is not even trying." He sent the report. He closed the channel. He sat looking at the vessel on his tactical display and tried to understand what he was dealing with. He had been in this business long enough to know the difference between a weapon that failed and a weapon that was allowed to fail. He had seen systems overwhelmed by superior technology, and he had seen systems quietly guided into ineffectiveness by something smarter than the thing using them. What he had just experienced had felt, in a way that disturbed him deeply, like the second thing. Not an enemy fighting back. Something else. Something that had let his full force throw everything it had at it, and had simply, without drama, made sure that none of it mattered. The unknown vessel sat on the line. The music played. The scorch marks on the hull caught the light of the distant star at the center of this system, and held it for a moment, and then the vessel's slow, existing rotation carried the marks back into shadow. Arakin looked at the stars beyond it and thought about the fact that something, at some point in the past, had managed to put those marks there. Something had hurt this vessel, however briefly, however little it had ultimately mattered. He found that he very much wanted to know what had happened to that something afterward. He suspected the answer would not be comforting. Part 4. The Hail That Got Answered. Senator Elvas Torren had been in politics for 37 years. He had survived 12 administrations, 4 constitutional crises, 2 border wars, and 1 full-scale internal audit of the Finance Committee, which most people who had been through it agreed was the worst of those things. He had survived all of it by being careful, measured, and by never walking into a room without knowing, in advance, what he was going to say. He walked into the emergency communications chamber on the morning of the 10th day, not knowing what he was going to say. The chamber was usually reserved for communication with foreign heads of state, a formal setting with the specific kind of decor that said, in the visual language of diplomatic spaces, that the Empire took things seriously and had been taking things seriously for a very long time. The long table, the deep chairs, the recording arrays positioned at exact angles so that nothing said in this room could be claimed to have been said in ambiguity. Today it also contained Admiral Karanis, Fleet Commander Arakin's senior aide who had come in person from the Interception Squadron, to brief the Senate delegation, Paril from the Xenomorphic Studies Division, 3 Senate Intelligence Committee members including Torren, and a communications specialist named Hareth, who was there to operate the arrays, and who had been given extremely clear instructions to stay in her corner and not say anything unless directly asked. The situation was as follows. The Empire had tried ignoring the vessel, which had not made it go away. The Empire had tried communicating with the vessel, which had not produced a response. The Empire had tried, through Fleet Commander Arakin, applying military force to the vessel, which had produced results that no one in the room was comfortable describing out loud. After 10 days of doing things that had not worked, the Senate Emergency Committee had voted to attempt formal diplomatic contact on the highest available frequency. The communications specialist Harith had prepared the signal. It was a full diplomatic hail, the kind used for first contact with a new civilization, the kind that announced, in language developed over centuries, that the party sending it represented a recognized galactic authority and was extending a formal invitation to dialogue. It was sent with the Empire's full identification signature attached, which in diplomatic terms was roughly equivalent to arriving at someone's door in your best clothes, with your name clearly on the invitation. They sent it, and then they waited. Torin sat at the head of the table with his hands folded in front of him, and did not let his face show anything. He had been doing this for 37 years, and he was very good at it. 20 minutes passed. The communications array beeped. Herath looked at her instruments, and then looked at Torin. Response signal, Senator. It's coming from the vessel. Open it, Torin said. The screen at the end of the table lit up. There was a brief moment of visual static, and then it cleared, and the people in the room found themselves looking at a person. The person was sitting at what appeared to be a desk on a ship. The desk had items on it, a flat screen, a container of some kind, what looked like a small piece of equipment in the process of being repaired. The person was not wearing anything ceremonial. They were wearing a plain dark uniform with small markings on the collar that Peril immediately began photographing with her personal recorder. The person was looking at the camera with an expression that was not unfriendly and not particularly surprised. It was the expression of someone who had been expecting a call and was not upset about it arriving when it did. Torin opened his mouth to deliver the formal diplomatic opening statement he had prepared. The person on the screen said, "Oh, you finally figured out the frequency," and then glanced down at something on the desk, set it aside, and looked back at the camera. Torin closed his mouth. There was a pause. Peril's recorder made a very small sound. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Yemi Okafor," the person said. "I've been expecting your contact. How can I help you?" Torin found his prepared statement again. It was written on a small card in his jacket pocket, but he knew it well enough not to need the card. He introduced himself with his full title and the full title of the Senate committee he represented. He named the Empire. He stated, in the careful language of 4,000 years of diplomatic tradition, that the Empire was prepared to enter into dialogue regarding the presence of the vessel in question at the boundary of sovereign imperial space. Lieutenant Commander Okafor listened to all of this. She nodded once or twice in the places where nodding seemed appropriate. When he finished, she said, "That's good. Yes, we can talk." Not, "We are honored." Not, "The representatives of our people extend greetings." Not any of the things that appeared in the first contact scripts that Peril had written over her entire career. Just yes, we can talk. Torin looked at his prepared questions. He had ordered them by priority, starting with the most essential and moving to the more exploratory ones. He began at the top. "Can you confirm the nature and origin of your vessel?" "Yes," Okafor said. "It's a human vessel. From Earth, originally, though we operate out of several locations now." Torin did not know the word human, and he did not know the word Earth. Neither did anyone else in the room. Peril wrote both words down and underlined them. "And your purpose in approaching Imperial space?" Torin asked. "We were asked to establish contact," Okafor said. "There's been some discussion among our people about making an introduction to your government. This seemed like a reasonable way to begin." "You entered the monitoring range of Imperial deep space relay systems without any prior announcement," Torin said. He kept his voice neutral. This created significant concern. "I understand," Okafor said. She did not sound particularly apologetic about it. "Your vessel did not respond to hailing attempts over a period of 10 days and more than 1,000 individual contact attempts." She nodded. "We were monitoring the hails." There was a pause. "You were monitoring them," Torin repeated. "Yes. But you did not respond." "No." She paused for a moment, as if considering how to explain something that she wasn't sure needed explaining. "We wanted to see what you would do." Torin looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked back at the screen. 37 years. 12 administrations. He had sat across tables from people who had deceived him, people who had threatened him, people who had tried in various ways to gain advantage through the careful management of information. He had always understood what they were doing, even when he couldn't prove it. He understood what Okafor had just told him. He understood it very clearly. He also understood that she had said it without any attempt to disguise it, which was either very honest or a form of pressure he didn't yet have a framework for. Your vessel has been subjected to a military assessment by Imperial forces, Torin said. He chose the word assessment carefully. Can you describe your experience of that event? Okafor picked up the container on her desk and took a small drink from it. She set it down. We noticed it, yes. Our forces reported that their weapons did not function as expected. That's correct, she said. Can you explain how that was accomplished? No, she said. Simple, clean, no apology attached. Torin wrote something on the small pad in front of him. Your vessel, he said carefully, has sustained significant damage in the past, based on the visible markings on the hull. Can you tell us the nature of those encounters? Something shifted in Okafor's expression. Not anger, not sadness, just a very small change in the set of her face. There for a moment and then gone. Old history, she said. Not relevant to this contact. He moved to his next question. He knew when he'd reached a wall. Is this vessel armed? He asked. No, she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Your vessel is unarmed, Torin said. That's correct. He looked at the Admiral. The Admiral's expression was the same as it had been since the screen came on. Controlled, professional, giving nothing away. Torin looked back at the screen. Then what? He said, and he took a breath before the next word, because he wanted to make sure his voice was level when he said it. Are your warships like? Okafor looked at him for a moment. It was not a long moment, but it was a deliberate one. The kind of moment where someone decides something, not because they hadn't already decided, but because they want the other person to see the decision being made. I've been authorized to tell you that question falls outside the scope of this diplomatic contact, she said. A pause. Short. The length of a blade being set down on a table. Someone will be in touch. She looked down at the desk for a second, picked up whatever she had been working on before the call, and then looked back up. I'll let you know if there's anything else you need from our end. Thank you for reaching out, Senator. The screen went dark. The communications specialist Harath sat very still in her corner. Peril had stopped writing and was staring at the blank screen. One of the other Intelligence Committee members had his hands flat on the table and was looking at them. Torin sat with his small card in his hand. He had prepared 7 questions. He had asked 5 of them. The one about the warships had been question 6. He had not gotten to question 7, which was, are you alone? In retrospect, he thought, he was glad he hadn't asked it. Admiral Karanis was the first person to speak. She was looking at the blank screen with the same controlled expression she had been wearing since the contact began, and she said, in a completely level voice, I need a direct line to Central Command. Encrypted. Right now. Nobody asked why. They could all see why. Torin sat for a moment longer. He thought about the way Okafor had answered questions. Plain answers. Honest answers. No diplomatic hedging. No misdirection. No careful management of impression. She had said exactly what she meant, including the things that were not reassuring. They had watched to see what the Empire would do. They had not responded to the weapons. The ship was unarmed. Someone would be in touch about the warships. He thought about the scorch marks on the hull that the briefing materials had described. This ship that was unarmed had survived things that had left those marks. This ship that was unarmed had made a full Imperial Interception Squadron's weapons stop working. This was not the warship. He thought about that for a long time while the room moved around him. Harath opening channels, the Admiral speaking quietly into a handset, Peril finally writing something in her notebook with a hand that was not quite steady. Not the warship. The unarmed one was not the warship. He picked up his small card with his 7 questions. He folded it carefully and put it back in his jacket pocket. He did not think he would need it for the next meeting. 5. Part 5. The Empire learns what humans built. The emergency session of the Imperial Senate Intelligence Committee convened at the 6th hour of the morning and did not stop until well into the following night. 31 senators, the full senior staff of the Xenomorphic Studies Division, Admiral Karanis and 2 of her senior fleet commanders, and a rotating cast of aides and analysts who came in with data and went out to get more data and came back in with different data, filled the chamber for 15 consecutive hours. Dravath Saul was there too, which was not entirely usual for a senior intelligence curator from a deep space monitoring station. He had been flown in by fast transport 2 days after his Priority Red report, and he had spent those 2 days feeling, alternatively, like the most important person involved in this situation, and the least qualified. He sat at a side table near the back of the chamber and tried to be useful by answering questions when questions were directed at him, and by not drawing attention to himself when they weren't. He had been in this room when Peril presented the preliminary analysis of the vessel they had been calling Unknown 7K since Theta 9's first report. He had been in this room when the recording of Senator Torrens' communication with Lieutenant Commander Okafor was played for the full committee. He had been in this room when Admiral Karanis laid out, in her precise and unalarmed voice, exactly what had happened when Fleet Commander Arakin's squadron had attempted to engage the vessel. He had been in this room for all of it, and he had spent all of it with a feeling that he could not entirely name, something between the recognition of a mistake he had made and the understanding that the mistake had been much larger than he had realized at the time. He had filed a Priority Amber report. He thought about that still. The Intelligence Committee had, in the 72 hours since the communication with Okafor, assembled everything it could about humanity. This was, it turned out, not very much. The species called humans from a place called Earth did not appear in any Imperial database at any level of classification. There was no record of their existence in the 4,000-year archive. There was no reference to them in any species catalog, no account of contact with them by any of the 22 known spacefaring civilizations, no trace in the historical record of any interaction with them at all. They had, apparently, simply not existed from the Empire's point of view until 11 days ago, when something very large and very patient had appeared on the edge of Relay Buoy 7 Keth's sensor range. This was, Peril explained to the committee, with the careful phrasing of someone delivering news that they themselves had not yet fully absorbed, unusual in a specific way. The Empire's monitoring network was not complete. There were regions of space it did not cover, distances it could not effectively observe. It was possible, she said, for a civilization to exist in a sufficiently distant or sufficiently unmonitored region without appearing in Imperial records. How large would that region have to be? One of the senators asked. Peril gave an answer that involved numbers and spatial coordinates that most of the people in the room did not follow in detail. The part they all followed was the end of it, which said, in plain language, that the region of space in which a civilization capable of building what they had seen could have existed without being detected would have to be very large indeed. Large enough to contain multiple systems? The senator asked. Potentially many, Peril said. The room was quiet for a moment. The analysis of the vessel itself had continued for the full 11 days since its first appearance. Peril's division had now produced a report that ran to 460 pages, and which, when stripped of all its careful scientific language, and all its methodological qualifications, and all its acknowledgments of uncertainty, said the following. The vessel was more advanced than anything in the Imperial inventory, in every area that had been measurable, and there were areas that had not been measurable because the measuring tools available had not been adequate to the task. The energy weapons had not functioned. The kinetic rounds had slowed and lost impact force. The guided missiles had lost targeting. The flanking group's navigation had been quietly and invisibly incorrect for 18 minutes. These were not the results of a system being overwhelmed by a stronger version of the same technology. They were the results of something else entirely, something that operated on principles that the Empire's best analysts could not currently explain. This was the part of Peril's presentation that the committee found most difficult, not the specific failures, but the explanation of why the failures could not be explained. She spent 40 minutes on this section, and at the end of it, a senator who had served on the Defense Committee for 20 years said that he had never before sat in a briefing and been told that the experts did not know why something had happened, for reasons that were themselves not understood. Peril said, with more patience than the comment perhaps deserved, that she understood his frustration. The communication with Okafor was played twice. The second time, the committee was asked to pay specific attention to the section where she confirmed the vessel was unarmed. "The vessel they sent as a first contact," Admiral Karanis said, standing at the front of the chamber with the recording paused on Okafor's face, "is unarmed. It came to our border without weapons. It demonstrated, when engaged by a full interception squadron, a defensive capability that our forces could not overcome. And it is unarmed." She let that sit for a moment. We asked what their warships were like. The response was that the question fell outside the scope of this contact. Someone would be in touch. Another pause. "I want the committee to understand what I am telling them. We cannot predict, from the evidence available, what their warships can do. We cannot predict it because the vessel they sent as a messenger, the one they use for deliveries, by their own account, already operates in ways that are outside what our weapons and our navigation and our sensors can reliably affect. The messenger vessel is beyond our current capability to engage. The warships are something else." A senator near the front said, "How far beyond?" The admiral looked at him. "I don't know," she said, "and that's the answer I'm most concerned about." Dreveth Sol, at his side table near the back, was writing notes. He had been writing notes throughout the session because it gave him something to do with his hands, and because he had found, in the past 11 days, that writing things down helped him think. He looked at what he had written. He had written, near the top of the first page, "They let us find what they wanted us to find." He had written this because Pereel had said something early in the session that had stayed with him, that all the intelligence gathered on the vessel had come from things the vessel had allowed to be seen. The drive signature that matched nothing in the database, allowed to be seen. The hull material that reflected thermal imaging in an unusual way, allowed to be seen. The transmission on the background monitoring channel, sent on a frequency that only existed in Imperial communications arrays, allowed to be sent. And the communication with Torin, allowed to happen when the vessel decided the time was right, not before. The vessel had arrived, and it had permitted the Empire to study it for 10 days, and everything the Empire had learned was what the vessel had chosen to teach. The things it had not chosen to teach, how the defensive systems worked, where it came from, how many more there were, what the actual warships could do, remained unknown, and they remained unknown not because the Empire hadn't tried to find them out, but because the vessel had simply declined to share them. It was an introduction, a managed, deliberate introduction, paced exactly the way the people who had sent the vessel wanted it paced. The war song was a message, the border positioning was a message, the passive deflection of the full military strike was a message, the selection of the background monitoring frequency was a message, the answer about warships being outside the scope of the contact was a message. Every piece of it, Dreveth Sol thought, was a message. And the message, when you laid all the pieces out in order, said, "We know where you are, we know what you are, we know what you can do, and we have come to introduce ourselves." He wrote, at the bottom of his second page, "We are not the ones who decided when this began." The session continued. There was a long discussion about how to respond, whether to request another communication with Okafor, whether to send a formal diplomatic delegation to the vessel, whether to attempt to gather more intelligence before making any move. There was a significant argument about whether the vessel's presence should be communicated to the broader Senate or kept within the Intelligence Committee for now. There was a debate about military options that ended when Admiral Karanis said, calmly, that she was happy to discuss military options but would like the committee to explain what options they had in mind, given the information they now had, and the debate stopped. Dreveth Sol had been awake for a very long time. He was not sure exactly how long because the hours had begun to feel different from each other in ways he couldn't precisely account for. He was tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that came from understanding something you couldn't ununderstand. He had filed a priority amber report. In 11 years, he had never sent anything upward that made anyone panic. This thought had felt, for most of his career, like a source of quiet professional pride. He turned it over in his mind now, and found it felt like something else entirely. He was sitting with this thought at his side table when the alert came. It did not come as an announcement in the chamber. It came as a signal to Hareth, the communications specialist who had been brought from the diplomatic contact chamber and who was now operating the session's communications array. Hareth looked at her instruments. Then she looked at Admiral Karanis. She did not say anything because the committee was in mid-discussion and she was not supposed to interrupt. but the look was enough. Karanis excused herself from the discussion and went to Herath Station. She leaned in and read the screen. Dreveth Sol, from the back of the room, could not see the screen, but he could see the Admiral's face. He had been watching the Admiral's face for 11 days. It was a very controlled face. It had stayed controlled through every briefing, every piece of difficult information, every question that had no comfortable answer. It was the kind of face that had 43 years of practice at not showing things. It showed something now. The Admiral straightened up. She looked at the committee chair and said, in a voice that had very little inflection in it, "I need to pause the session." She walked to the main display at the front of the chamber and entered a command sequence. The screen filled with a sensor read, a tactical display showing the space around them, the boundary of sovereign space, the position of the monitoring station, and the fleet. And, at the edge of the display, a cluster of new contacts. 47 of them. They were at the far end of sensor range, barely visible, their drive signatures incomplete at this distance, their shapes not yet resolvable into clear images. They were moving. They were moving in the same direction and at the same velocity, arranged in a formation that was not accidental. They were decelerating, slowly, with the same deliberate pace that had characterized everything that had come before them. The room was very quiet. The automated hailing system had already fired, Dreveth Sol knew, because that was what the automated system did. It had sent 412 hails to the first vessel over 10 days. It had just sent the first hail to 47 vessels at once. No response came. Of course no response came. He looked at the display. 47 drive signatures, decelerating, on a heading that led here, moving with the same unhurried, patient certainty as the first vessel had moved. He thought about everything that the first vessel had been, the size of it, the age of the damage on its hull, the way the weapons had simply failed to function near it, the way Okafor had sat at her desk in her plain uniform eating her meal, and had answered questions with the easy calm of someone who had nothing to prove. The first vessel was a courier. It carried mail. He looked at 47 incoming contacts on the display and understood, in the quiet and complete way that you understand things when there is no longer any use in not understanding them, that the courier had not been the message. It had been the envelope. The message was arriving now. Dreveth Sol put down his pen. He looked at the screen. He thought about the small yellow alert icon in the lower right corner of his console 11 days ago, the one he had let sit while he finished filling out his form. He thought about his priority amber report. He thought about his note at the end of the third report, the one that said, "It knows we are here." 47 contacts on the display, decelerating, patient, making no aggressive move and requiring no weapons because whatever the weapons would have done did not matter. Not to them, not anymore. The Empire had spent 11 days trying to understand one vessel. What it had learned was that the one vessel was a courier. The courier had been enough to defeat everything the Empire sent against it without trying. The room was still quiet. The senators and analysts and military officers sat with the display, and with what it meant. Dreveth Sol sat at his side table near the back and looked at his notes. At the bottom of the second page he had written, "We are not the ones who decided when this began." He picked up his pen and wrote, beneath that, "We are not the ones who will decide when it ends." He set the pen down. Outside, in the dark, 47 ships came on.